You're tuned in to More Living with Jim Brogan, broadcast live from the Brogan Financial Studios at News Talk 98.7, where old-fashioned values, expert knowledge, and genuine understanding come together to give you the retirement straight talk you deserve. Jim's a former National Advisor of the Year recipient and a financial educator, and he's here today to talk about how you can live out the best years of your life. Jim and the Brogan Financial team have been helping retirees and pre-retirees across the Southeast for over 20 years in their pursuit of financial independence. You can reach them during the week at 865-862-6800. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn, because More Living with Jim Brogan starts now.
Hello, East Tennessee, and welcome to More Living with Jim Brogan, where it's all about living the best years of your life your way. Excuse me, these fall allergies are certainly getting to me with the changing of the seasons. Let's talk about music. Music brings people together, whether it's rhythm, lyrics, a catchy tune. Certainly for me, the tune is where it starts. But music tells a story. It's a gift from the artist to the listener. And right here in Knoxville, we've had a fundamental impact on country music. It began its journey right here in Knoxville in the 1920s. And since then, of course, Knoxville's been the launch pad for many of country music's biggest stars, including legends like Dolly Parton, Roy Acuff, and Chet Atkins. And then, of course, we got contemporary country artists Morgan Wallen and Kelsey Ballerini. How did country music get started in what was once the sleepy town of Knoxville? And today, as music and history are colliding, we're joined by a great friend of the show, Knoxville historian Jack Neely. He's a journalist who's been writing about Knoxville since the 1990s, and he is the executive director of the Knoxville History Project, where he and his team spend their time archiving Knoxville's history and offering ways for visitors and residents alike to get to know Knoxville's fascinating past. Welcome back to the show, Jack.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Good to be here.
It's great having you back. We're going to dive into country music, or music in general, but first, you are the history expert in Knoxville. Did you grow up, I mean, you've been kind of Knoxville's historian since the 90s. Did you grow up, with a fascination for history?
I did, but I didn't know very much about Knoxville history. My family would take me to great historic places like Charleston and we go to Chattanooga Battlefield and Nashville. I knew all about Nashville history and the Carmack assassination and all that stuff when I was 10 years old. But I didn't know much about Knoxville at all because people just didn't talk about it much. And I didn't really get into it until I was a journalist. I was a full-time journalist for several papers, including Metro Pulse, the longest period. And I found out that people were really, really interested in this stuff, and that all news stories have backstories. They have you really can't understand the news unless you figure out how we got there. And so I began telling those stories and found out that people responded to that in a big way. And I began writing a column for Metro Pulse back in the early 90s, and that kind of went on from there.
Yeah, and I get fascinated by it. I was telling my wife last night, Jack, kind of a combination, preparing for this show, and then I'm also reading a history book about our presidents. And I was like, I don't know why I wasn't interested in history when I was a kid. I mean, I can't get enough of it as an adult whenever I can read
how can you not
something.
be? I mean, history is a study of everything, really. And I think that everybody really is interested in history if they just figure out how to, turn off the idea of is there a quiz or a test about this, and turn on just the fascination we had with learning about things that we've had since we were kids.
I think that's right. Talk to us, how far back, when we talk about music in Knoxville, talk about the beginning of our music history. How far back do we go here?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the early years are murky, as is the case with a whole lot of stuff. The early newspapers didn't cover concerts. They would sometimes advertise them and things like that, but we didn't. There's not much about what kind of music we heard here. There were sometimes like a group would come through with some vocalists and they would perform at the Lamar House, but we don't know, what kind of music it was. That was, 200 years ago, like, 12 or something like that. But and we knew that they had a lot of people had violins, and this is interesting. Black and white people had violins. When there was if someone escaped slavery, they would say, well, he's a very good violinist, just as a point to a way to describe him. But often there were fiddlers at dances and balls and things like that. But we don't know very much about what they performed. A lot of people had Scots Irish or pure Irish heritage, and some of them may have brought over some of their tunes, and I wouldn't doubt that a lot of the early music, very very early music, resembled old British Isles tunes. But there's not a lot of detail. There's actually almost no detail that I found about that in the early days.
You talk about violins and fiddles. I grew up a violin player, so I'm going to ask you an interesting question.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Do you know there is a physical difference? Like I played violin, but I would play fiddle music on my violin. But there is a physical difference between a violin and a fiddle. Do you know what it is?
No. Is this a joke or?
No, it's real.
Yeah,
so the bridge on a violin, on a fiddle, the bridge that the strings go over, where you play the strings just below the bridge. The bridge on a fiddle is lower, and it makes it easier to play two strings at one time. Isn't that interesting?
Okay. That is interesting. Yeah.
So anyway, you brought up violins and fiddles, so I just had to chime in there.
It's surprising. I mean, because violins it's a fairly complex instrument, and it's surprising that we had more violins than guitars. And
that is wild. That is wild. Now we had a lot of immigrants moving into the area after the Civil War. So did music start to really take shape at that time?
Many of them, in fact, before the Civil War, we had two waves of refugees, basically, from the German-speaking people from Central Europe. That we had hundreds of them coming into East Tennessee, and also at the same time, the Irish famine was going on. People were starving to death in Ireland, so they were coming to America. So we had a wave of them too. So this Knoxville in the post-Civil War era was, suddenly a much bigger and very different place than it had been, back in 1840 and 1850. It was kind of a forgotten, former capital for a long time. But the Civil War, the railroads was really what spawned all this. We suddenly got railroads in 1855, and with railroads we got industry, and we got all these people looking for work coming here, and they were from all over the Western world.
Sure.
And they brought their own traditions with them. But some of the most interesting ones were the Germans, and some of them brought classical music basically. And there was a guy from Leipzig named Gustav Knabe who came here. He'd been a horn player in Mendelssohn's orchestra, and he came here to Knoxville. And for the next 40 years or so, he became known as the father of music in East Tennessee. And you wouldn't think that classical music, Mendelssohn and opera, he was especially interested in. He began a series, what's called the Knoxville Philharmonic Society in 1867. That this was all classical operatic stuff that they were putting on, and you wouldn't think that would be that related to country music, but it turned out to just kind of open the floodgates of everything, and in a very interesting and kind of dramatic way. I saw just last night. I saw an opera that was performed here in Knoxville in 1882, and people were excited about it. It was a fun opera from England called Pirates of Penzance, and they had a performance of that at the Tennessee Theater last night. And I happen to know
interestingly enough, you mentioned classical music. The Knoxville, our Knoxville Symphony Orchestra is really a treasure that we have. It's a tremendous gift in our little corner of the world, because for a city of our size, our orchestra is quite good, and of course under the direction of Aram Demergen. Is it true that the KSO has a plausible claim to be the oldest continuously operating symphony orchestra in the South?
Yes. In fact, I looked into that. There's another claimant in Georgia, I think, but this is, but I think we've got a better claim, and but what we're talking about actually before all that, because this thing that happened after the Civil War, we had it wasn't really a full big orchestra like we have today, but they had enough people to accompany singers and that sort of thing that they were doing back then. But Knabe, this guy from Leipzig, began getting involved with these music festivals that we had in the 1880s. And this was I mentioned Pirates of Penzance was performed here in late '82 and early '83. We had the Spring Music Festival, and this was they didn't call it any kind of music; it was just music festival. It was almost all opera. And that was at at Staub's Opera House, which was downtown. It was built by a Swiss guy, Peter Staub, who moved here and was elected mayor of Knoxville. Much appreciated here, and also outside at Chilhowie Park and things like that. But in 1883, it had a surprise at this festival. It had several famous singers, some from Austria and other places, that were performing here in Knoxville. And then in late May of 1883. They said, we've got one more surprise for you, and they brought out after the soprano had been singing, they brought out people kind of surprised to see a bunch of old men came on stage with fiddles, and they said, we're going to have a little fiddling competition here, this is a seated audience of probably 1,000 people in Staub's Opera House, and they went ahead and did it, and people loved it. You wouldn't expect people in tuxedos to be excited about country music, but they played old Turkey in the Straw and Napoleon's Retreat and Bonaparte's Retreat and things like that. But that was the sort of thing they were playing, and this may have been the first country music concert in history.
Wow!
In front of an actual audience. Because people were familiar with these tunes. They'd heard them. Some uncle would play them beyond the barn or something like that, or it might be at a dance or something. But to have an actual people paying attention to it, this is really something. And it began a surprising tradition here, because after that there was a series of other fiddling contests. People saw how popular it was, and they started having these fiddling contests at Market Square after that. So that kind of went on from there.
We're visiting with Jack Neely, Knoxville historian. And Jack, it seems like I could ask you any question at all about any little crook or cranny or corner of Knoxville, and you would have the detailed information, as you're just an encyclopedia. When we come back, we'll talk about a little bit more the evolution of music in Knoxville, including radio, and then, of course, country music being the cradle. Starting in Knoxville. So stay with us as we visit with Knoxville historian Jack Neely. This is News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
Welcome back to More Living here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. I'm Jim Brogan, your host, and we're visiting with Knoxville historian Jack Neely. He's just an encyclopedia. It's always so great and interesting when we have him on the line with us. Of course, usually we're in studio, but due to my schedule, we're doing this virtually, so we appreciate you calling in, Jack. Radio broadcasting started in 1897, and music was on the airwaves beginning in 1906. When did Knoxville start broadcasting music?
Yeah, well, there weren't actually radio stations until the 1920s, and Knoxville was fairly early. It was in the pack, at least, with that. I think 1922 is when we had our first radio station, but that was and live music was one of the early features of it right away. That this was, of course, in the 1920s, it was the jazz age, and what people wanted to hear is jazz, and that's mainly what you heard on Knoxville radio. Although they did have quite a variety. I think they had more of a variety than we do today on the radio, because they would have some jazz and then some dance music, and then some a classical concert or something like that, and then maybe a comic bit or something. But country music just kind of then began slipping in around the sides, and kind of as a novelty of sorts. But it's interesting, at the same time, we had something else going on. We'd been having these fiddling competitions downtown, but also people who tried to make a living in the streets playing music, and what we'd call buskers today. They were guys who would just sit down with a fiddle or a banjo or a guitar and sing and play and hope to get some nickels. And it wasn't a very great way to make a living, so it was mainly people who were disabled who did this, who weren't able to hold a regular job, like especially blind people. And a lot of the early recording stars were blind people. Charlie Oakes, George Renault. These were guys who played, for nickels in the streets. But the way this happened is an interesting business story that might be interesting to your readers. There was a guy named James Sturkey here in town. You might recognize the name Sturkey from the old furniture company. But
Sure.
Sturkey Brothers Furniture was a huge. They had a giant chain of furniture stores throughout the South, more than 60 of them. And they, furniture companies furniture stores were where we bought your phonographs in those days. And phonograph music at the time was mainly, the phonograph records were mainly opera stuff and some orchestral stuff and so forth. That's what they put on records in the earliest days of recorded music. And Sturkey got these machines, and like a lot of technology, it got less expensive and easier to use as years went on. But he was curious. He was puzzled by why working people weren't buying phonographs, because they were cheap enough to buy for most families, and people just weren't buying them. And he found out it was because they didn't have the music they were wishing for. So he got a bunch of these blind musicians from the streets of Knoxville and sent them to New York and to make records in 1924. And some of them were hits at this time. And this is before the Bristol sessions. This was an early wave of country music. But he even got Uncle Dave Macon, very famous performer, banjoist, one of the first stars of the Grand Ole Opry later on. But his first records were made for Sturkey. So this was a way that he made records to sell phonographs, and he was successful with it.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me that all of that is, but especially the part about a lot of the first records being made were blind musicians. That's a fascinating story. Now, the 1929-1930 St. James Hotel recordings have been recently released. Jack, what's the story behind these recordings?
Yeah, well, Sturkey was involved with that too. He saw it as a great way to keep promoting country music, and I can't tell if he was a fan. He was an older man at this time, but was just interested in it. And he kind of enabled this to happen. But Brunswick Vocalion, that may not ring a bell now, but Brunswick is actually the same. You may know pool tables and boats, and they're involved in a lot of recreational stuff. Well, they were always kind of on the fun side of business, and but they were making phonograph records back in the 1920s, and they were competitors with the big time Victor and the other record makers in those days. But they wanted to come to Knoxville, and I think they were kind of persuaded to come to Knoxville to make some kind of like field recordings, except they did it with a proper studio in the St. James Hotel, which was on Wall Avenue, right by Market Square back then. And they set WNOX assisted them with this. WNOX was one of our very first radio stations, and but they went into WNOX studios with the Sturkey people, and the guy at the controls was a guy named Dick Voynow, who had been a jazz icon of sorts. He had been the piano player for Bix Beiderbecke's famous jazz band of the 1920s. But he was interested in getting a wide variety of people, black and white and high and low, everything. And they made just an amazing number of recordings, hundreds of recordings there in the studio. And they were released in a big box set several years ago that was nominated for a Grammy. But it's called the Knoxville Sessions. And a recent version of that is called Satan is Busy in Knoxville. And that's the name, I guess, the most colorful cut of all the recordings they made. It was a black woman from East Knoxville who was kind of a bluesy sort of a singer, and it really got people's attention. But this is one of the most interesting cuts on the album, and that's the name of the new CD. That's kind of the best of the Knoxville Sessions that Ted Olson at East Tennessee State University did. But,
we're visiting with Jack Neely, the Knoxville historian, and we're talking about the history of music in Knoxville. Now, specifically, Jack, We are considered the cradle of country music. And you mentioned fiddling contests held annually on
Yeah.
Market Square in the 20s and the 30s. One thing I want to mention about that, live music has made its return to Market Square over the past 10, 20 years.
Yeah,
Talk
it's
a
great
little
to
bit
see.
about some of the evolution of live performances in Knoxville.
Yeah, well, it was. I think a lot of the early ones. I mentioned that early one, but that was kind of a novelty at an opera festival. But from there, it went into those contests and also the street musicians and so forth. There was not live. There was not as much concert. People just didn't go to country music concerts in those days. People thought people would be bored listening to the same performer for an hour or two. It's kind of funny about that because usually you would have a performer at a movie theater and he might play for 10 or 15 minutes before a movie. And that was about as much of a concert as you would get. But then along came radio and studio audiences, and they were catching on by the 1930s. This is the idea of having a performer playing on live radio with a studio audience there to applaud at the end.
Yeah.
Was kind of a model for that. But the radio had come in, and it wasn't immediately. It wasn't until about 1930 that you start hearing a little bit more and more country music. Still, there's more jazz, I think, until 1935 and the late 30s. And there's always, even WMX, famous for country music, always had a lot of pop music and jazz on it. But these country shows got to be more interesting, especially when a guy named Roy Acuff showed up, and Roy Acuff was an interesting character in a lot of ways. He was known. You see his name all over the newspapers in the 1920s, but not for being a musician. He was an athlete, and that was mainly what he was known for. He played football, he played basketball, and was just a triple threat because he played baseball. He was a really aggressive, really talented player, but he loved baseball more than anything else. And but that was when he was playing for Central High School up in Fountain City. But he after high school, he was kind of lost for a while and got involved in small time crime and so forth. He was a bootlegger. He got arrested for assault once or twice. He was actually shot once in a bootlegging joint. This is something that's not in any of his biographies. But he was a tough character, but he just began playing with the fiddle. He'd come from a musical family, never took it very seriously, and then began working with a guy that worked in a filling station in Fountain City, and began working on fiddle techniques and kind of audience presentation. And he just burst onto the scene suddenly in like 1934, 35. And before Roy Acuff, country music was considered kind of old-fashioned and sentimental, something old folks liked. But Roy Acuff came out with this kind of unusual, kind of surprising, aggressive sound with this crazy, kind of piercing voice that got people's attention, and it began drawing crowds of men and boys, which was unusual for country music at that time, and so much so that and this is another business thing. That when he was playing on Market Square, which was a city-owned facility, the theaters, the movie theaters of Gay Street complained to the city that the city was subsidizing competition because they were losing audiences for the cowboy movies, the Saturday cowboy serials that they counted on for income. That everybody was going to the Roy Acuff shows, and they said this is not fair. The city shouldn't subsidize this by letting them play at the Market Hall. But that was but he was just a phenomenon. He had a band called the Crazy Tennesseans, and they had a new instrument called the dobro, which most people had never seen before. And that was one of their several kind of attractions. But he just became a phenomenon and just swept the nation. He was the guy that took country music and made it a national thing, especially with his record that came out, the Great Speckled Bird in 1936, I think. But that took him to Nashville. He went to Nashville for the radio tower, and that was what was drawing everybody. The WSM radio tower was unlike, had a longer reach than any other radio tower in the South at the time.
We're visiting with Jack Neely, Knoxville historian. We're talking about Knoxville and it's being the cradle of country music, but all of Knoxville's music history is so interesting. When we come back, we'll have more about innovations in country music that connect to the broader world. We'll also have our dollars and cents segment. We have an upcoming tax avalanche in our country, especially with financial and retirement planning. What can you be doing about this? How can you be smart about it? Stay with us. This is More Living with Jim Brogan here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
This is More Living with Jim Brogan, where it's all about living the best years of your life your way. We're visiting with Jack Neely this morning on WNOX. I said WNOX, which of course was the predecessor to WOKI. And of course, Jack was talking about back in the day, WNOX was a country music station. Before we get to Jack about the history of country music in Knoxville, however, it is time for dollars and cents.
Want to be sure you are getting the most out of your retirement? For all the years of your retirement? That's the primary goal of More Living with Jim Brogan and our Dollars and Cents segment, where we provide you with an important financial tip that will help positively impact the quality of your life in retirement. And now, here's Jim with this week's Dollars and Cents tip.
I think we've got a tax crisis coming in financial planning and retirement planning here in America. I think we could have an avalanche of tax issues. And I think it is very, very overlooked in retirement planning. You know, typically you have more control over your income taxes in retirement than at any other time in your life. And unfortunately, many of the approaches to this, you know, the fact that income taxes are going up the end of next year, we have ballooning federal debt, $35 trillion. We got ballooning budget deficits. Where will we be? We know taxes are going up at the end of next year. Where will they be 10, 15 years from now? And historically, when we have had severe challenges in the United States, if you look at our history back to 1900, there's usually, you know, whether that's war, Great Depression, Great Recession, we've had a couple of pandemics in that last 120 years. The reality is there's great stimulus from the federal government, in many cases tremendous easy money policy from the Federal Reserve, and then once we get through those periods of time, we typically see things come back under control. And that's not happened since the last two crises we've had here in the United States. We had the Great Recession, 2007, 08 into early 09, and then we had the pandemic in 2020. So we've had massive stimulus both from Congress and from the Federal Reserve, but our ballooning deficit is becoming a bigger and bigger of an issue. The problem is very few people do true tax planning. You know, like I talk often about the tax, you probably heard me before about the difference between tax planning and tax preparation. You know, tax preparation is what we do with our accountant every year, or if we do our own thing with like TurboTax or a self-help software, we're doing that in the February, March, early April every year, but that's preparing taxes with data that's already happened. You know, when we get into February and March next year, there's nothing I can do to undo a transaction in September of last month that created a taxable event, whether it was a dividend or capital gain that I had, or whether I took a taxable distribution from my IRA. I cannot undo those things. So there's very little you can do with tax preparation to save on your taxes. Tax planning, on the other hand, is looking forward and being very, very intentional. What am I paying now? What might I pay in the future? And there is a sweet spot between retirement age and age 73 or 75, because those are the ages, depending on the year you're born, that you have to start taking taxable distributions from your retirement account. So you're going to lose a lot of control of your tax consequences once you turn 73 or 75. The problem is many people talk about they approach this with a very simplistic approach. Hey, do Roth conversion. Well, Roth conversion can make a lot of sense, but it may not. What's the upfront tax cost? What is your taxable income now? What's it going to be later? You know, if you're in the last 10 years of your working life, your taxable income is probably higher than it's ever been and ever will be. Now, yeah, tax brackets may go up, but what's your taxable income going to look like? I was reading an article this week from Investment News. An advisor was talking that the Vanguard Group, they pretty much 100% of the time recommend Roth conversion. Well, it is just not that simple. You know, you've got to look at where you are now, where we're headed in the future. When you have an upfront tax cost like that, it decreases your investment base. You have to be very careful that you don't do that too much too early in retirement. So don't get me wrong, Roth conversions can be wonderful things, but they're not for everyone. And likewise, capital gains tax planning is critically important. People always talk about harvesting losses. It's smart to harvest gains. We have many clients, we do this every year, this time of year, in a 0% tax bracket. So your tax planning moving forward, I think, is going to become more and more critically important. I think we're going to have more challenges with our income tax system. So be sure you include the fundamental part of tax planning in your financial plan.
That's our Dollars and Cents segment for this week. You can find this week's Dollars and Cents segment and others by visiting BroganFinancial.com.
Do check us out online, BroganFinancial.com. We've got a wealth of resources. If you go there and click on resources, you can pull up reports we've written, all kinds of blogs and things like that. We also have our radio shows, and all of our radio podcasts are on the website if you click on radio. My final class is with Pellissippi State Community College, and it is a one-night class, Tax Planning in Your Retirement. It is on November the 12th at Pellissippi State, Hardin Valley, and it's 6:30 to 8:30 p.m., so in 1 2-hour session, I'm going to cover as much as I can about what you need to know about tax planning as you get close to retirement and retire. How should you incorporate Roth conversion? Should you? What is gain harvesting? What does that look like? How does your Social Security strategy impact your tax planning? There are just so many things to talk about. Again, that's Tuesday, November the 12th, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at Pellissippi State, Hardin Valley. You can go to PellissippiTaxPlanning.com for more information. Again, PellissippiTaxPlanning.com. You can download a syllabus and click to register. Today we're visiting with Jack Neely, Knoxville historian. He is such an encyclopedia. We could talk to him about, I think, anything in terms of the history of Knoxville. We're talking specifically about music and Knoxville being the cradle of country music. And one thing I do want to ask you about, Jack, you know, music is a great way to tell stories.
Yeah.
Who are some of the greatest music storytellers from our area, in your opinion?
Oh, well, of course, you got to start with Dolly Parton, I think.
Yeah.
She's one of the best songwriters in our history here. People like Roy Acuff, he wrote a few songs, but he, converted other songs into new life. Like I mentioned Grace Pickled Bird, which was, I think, a religious song. He just heard people singing, some black people singing on the street in Knoxville, and kind of made it a country song. But yeah, there are several Everly Brothers. They sang a lot of other people's songs, but wrote some of their own too. Taffy's Clown, which is was their unusual but biggest hit about kind of a failed romance in high school. There are several good songwriters, but of course, I think going outside of Knoxville, Hank Williams, it's hard to beat him.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
He has a strong Knoxville connection, and that he spent his last hours here. But yeah.
Yeah, but certainly from this area, Dolly pops to mind so much.
Yeah.
Now, Jack, you've been looking into innovations in country music that connect to the broader world. What are some of your discoveries?
Yeah, well, a lot of them. I mentioned earlier the dobro, putting this instrument that had been created for the Hawaiian music craze of the 1920s, and it was a failure. It was created by these Hungarian guys on the West Coast. But the first person to make it nationally popular was Roy Acuff, putting it in country songs, and you can hear echoes of the dobro, whether it's a dobro or a pedal steel or whatever, in country music today. That was what was introduced by this thing that began as a Hawaiian sound. But then Chet Atkins came here, and he was from Union County, just like Roy Acuff was born there. Interesting, they never lived in the same city at the same time until they both were in Nashville. But Chet got here right after Roy had left, but was first a fiddle player in Knoxville, and then began playing with the guitar, trying to make it sound more interesting than just than guitars usually sound. And he heard this record from Europe by Django Reinhardt, a jazz, they called him a gypsy jazz performer in those days. And he began listening to this really unusual style of a jazz performer, and began playing, trying to sound like Django Reinhardt. And he just happened to pick up this record backstage at WNOX, and was fascinated with it. And he, much of the rest of his life, thought of himself as a jazz performer. People called him a country performer, even because he was from Tennessee. But he later on said that his unusual style, in which he developed his own style, but was him failing to sound like Django Reinhardt. But
now,
it's interesting. The very first concert he ever gave in Knoxville was he was called a jazz performer, jazz guitarist. Chet Atkins.
Wow. Well, Jack, country music, speaking of that, country music sounds very different today than country music from the 1920s. And this has become kind of controversial for some people that are what they would call themselves country music purists. What classifies something as country music today?
Oh God, it's just sometimes it's just an older voice, and sometimes some people say is rock and roll slowed down with an older sounding voice, is what country music is taken. It used to have, certainly drums were never part of country music until our lifetimes, and percussion and that sort of thing, and it's really it's become kind of a crossover pop thing. What you call Taylor Swift.
Well, it really has, and if you think of some of the instruments, there are certain instruments that definitely, you mentioned the dobro, the steel guitar. I remember when I first heard about the dobro, it was probably 25 years ago. A good friend had moved to Nashville, was pursuing country music, and he and his wife were talking about the dobro, and I was like, what's the difference in a dobro and a steel guitar? But there are certainly certain things that when you hear it, it's country, but it has almost become country pop. I do want to ask you, Jack, Knoxville's no stranger to rock and roll. So what's our history when it comes to rock and roll?
Well, there's another innovation that begins with it begins with a lot of black musicians who came through here. Bo Diddley and Fast Domino and all these guys Little Richard were playing at Chilhowie Park every few weeks, it seems like, in the early 1950s, and people heard that. But some of the people who heard that were the couple kids at West High School, the Everly Brothers, and they had been singing in a kind of a sweet gospel harmony family act for their whole life with their mother and father, and they split. They were not succeeding with on Kaz Walker's show on WROL with that act, and they became fascinated with Bo Diddley records and tried to play guitar like Bo Diddley, and add that to this sweet gospel harmony, natural brother harmony that they had, and came up with a bunch of songs that really just took the nation by storm and rock and roll in 1955. And if you go to Everly Brothers Park, which is in Bearden, and just a little thing right by Kingston Pike, they've got a lot of inscriptions that were submitted just for that park by people like Paul McCartney, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. Paul Simon was a big fan of the Everly Brothers, and they all had this great debt to the Everly Brothers because Paul McCartney said that the Beatles were really just trying to sound like the Everly Brothers in their early days. That he was Phil and John was Don Everly. That was how they began. So that was a hugely influential thing on rock and roll. I didn't realize how I'd always heard of the Everly Brothers and recognized their songs like "Wake Up Little Susie" and "Cabbie's Clown" and all those, but I didn't know what a great impact they had on the whole world of rock and roll. And then after they were even split up, they were still having an impact through the records.
That's Jack Neely. We're talking with him, a Knoxville historian, about the Knoxville and the cradle of country music and the evolution of country music. When we come back for our last segment, I do want to ask him about some of the venues here in Knoxville and some of the recent things that have been going on here. So stay with us. This is More Living with Jim Brogan here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
This is More Living here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. We're visiting with Jack Neely, Knoxville historian, and the fascinating music history of Knoxville. We're the cradle of country music. We have the most legitimate claim to our symphony orchestra, the Knoxville Symphony, being the oldest continuously operating symphony orchestra in the South. So it's just been very, very interesting. In terms of our music venues, Jack, music outdoors, of course, is a wonderful experience. Knoxville also has some good venues for live performances. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution? I mean, Market Square to Chilhowie Park. We got Tennessee Theater now, Food City Arena. Talk about the evolution of the venues.
Yeah, that's interesting because a lot of people didn't think that country music needed an actual venue. They did it in studios, WNOX and WROL especially, and they didn't mention the shows like Midday Merry-Go-Round on WNOX, which was run by a guy named Lowell Blanchard from Chicago, who came down and really just was trying to capture the Roy Acuff phenomenon on another station, basically, with Midday Merry-Go-Round, and that was successful for 25 years, and it was a live audience. They had like a 200 seats theater on Gay Street, and drew people in for a long time, and was very significant. But a lot of outdoor venues, the old fairgrounds, things like that, when they thought we were expecting a big crowd, they would do something outside. And one thing that's kind of been forgotten, there was something called the Hillbilly Homecoming in Maryville. And this was one of the only times that I've ever seen Dolly Parton's name at a public event that people were invited to, rather than just in the studio. And this was like in 1957, 58. She was at the Maryville's Hillbilly Homecoming as a little, she was a little kid singing on the stage. But what else? Oh, of course, the old Lyric Theater, which was kind of a rundown old opera house on Gay Street. In fact, it's the same room as the old Staub's Opera House I was talking about earlier, where they had the music festivals in the 1880s. The same building was the Lyric in the 1940s, and that was where they had WNOX barn dance, they called it. And they would have like a Saturday night show, and they would have Chet Atkins and the Carter Sisters and people like that would play there. But it's interesting that we had other venues, but they really didn't like Alumni Memorial at UT and the movie theaters didn't have much. Tennessee Theater did not have much country music at all. I wrote a book about the Tennessee, and just very, very little. They had like a midnight show of Grand Ole Opry there once in 35, but it was mainly, what you heard there mainly was jazz, when there was live music at all, which kind of ended with World War II. But so it's pretty complicated. And I think it was not until the 1960s that people started, it was a Coliseum, that people started saying, well, this is a legit genre that people are going to come out and want to see. So that's when we start having the big country jamborees, when Johnny Cash would come with 7 or 8 other performers and do a long show with a whole lot of variety to it.
Well, that's Jack Neely. Yeah. Jack, I hate to say this, we're out of time. I just love talking to you. You're just and hearing your knowledge. Real quickly, do you have a favorite music genre? I know we've been talking a lot about country music today. What's your favorite?
Gosh, the more I've talked to musicians, and I want to be like them, because they don't think like a lot of people say, I like this music, therefore I don't like that music. Good musicians, I think, like all kinds of music, and I think that's the best way to be, and because all music is interesting. And
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah.
Well,
that's Jack Neely, Knoxville historian. Yeah. We've been talking about the history of country music, especially here in Knoxville, but also all of the interesting histories of music. Jack, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Enjoyed it. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's Jack Neely, Knoxville historian. Be sure to check out my website, broganfinancial.com. My last class of the fall is at Pellissippi State, Hardin Valley on November the 12th, Tax Planning and Your Retirement. You can go to PellissippiTaxPlanning.com for more information. Thank you for tuning in this week. Thank you, Wayne, for engineering the show. Thank you, Jill, for helping produce the show. Have a very, very blessed weekend. You've been listening to More Living with Jim Brogan right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
The views expressed by Jim Brogan and his guests are not that of Cumulus Media. Any discussion of financial, legal, and tax planning strategies is not intended to be individualized advice and is general in nature. Always consult with your advisor for advice specific to your needs. This program's content does not represent a recommendation of any particular security, strategy, or investment by Jim Brogan or Brogan Financial Incorporated.